A very good afternoon and welcome to the BBC News at 1 o'clock. Well, here at Westminster, the Queen has performed the state opening of Parliament. If all the ritual and pomp followed precisely the 55 previous occasions during her reign that she's laid out the government's legislative programme, well, there was one important difference today. This was the first Queen's speech of a coalition government. There are wide-ranging proposals, but the top priority of the Conservative Liberal Democrat partners is to reduce the deficit and boost economic growth. Our first report is from our political correspondent, Ben Wright.
With its carriage, cavalry and trumpets, much about the Queen's 56th procession to Parliament was the same. But a crucial element has changed. For the first time in her reign, Her Majesty's government is a coalition of two political parties rather than one.
Hats off, strangers!
As Parliament prepared for the royal address, the key players took their place. The robed lords and ladies were joined by the Queen, who waited for Black Rod to summon the MPs from the House of Commons. The disagreements and arguments of the election now past, the new Prime Minister and his politically mixed team of ministers paired up with their opponents and strolled through Parliament to hear what the Queen had to say. The speech is delivered by the monarch but written by ministers, and the first policy mentioned will overshadow all others.
The first priority is to reduce the deficit and restore economic growth. Action will be taken to accelerate the reduction of the structural budget deficit.
Dealing with the deficit will dominate this Parliament, and a bill dealing with financial regulation is one of 5 from the Treasury. But there's much more from the party's 2 manifestos that might make it into law.
My government will seek to build a strong and fair society by reforming public services and encouraging individual and social responsibility. Legislation will be introduced to enable more schools to achieve academy status.
And school reform is a key part of the government's plans. The Academies Bill would allow more schools in England, including primaries, to become academies. It would also give teachers more say over what they teach. The government promises radical welfare reform that would simplify the benefit system and, ministers believe, get 5 million people into work. A Scotland bill will give greater tax-raising and borrowing powers to the Scottish Parliament. And a big dose of political reform is planned for Westminster. 5-year fixed-term parliaments are a key part of a package that could also lead to a change in the voting system.
My government will propose parliamentary and political reform to restore trust in democratic institutions and rebalance the relationship between the citizen and the state. A bill will be introduced for a referendum on the alternative vote system for the House of Commons.
The Lib Dems will be pleased with what's called a freedom bill, which would curb the DNA database and CCTV. ID cards are also about to be binned. The Queen heads back to Buckingham Palace, leaving the politics of this new Parliament to the politicians. Now, the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives in this coalition are confident that their manifestos have meshed together very well, but it's crucial that they take their own backbenchers with them if their programme is going to succeed. And one issue above any other is the dominant one of this Parliament, and that's the spending cuts to come.
On the economy, when they bring forward plans that protect jobs and businesses and that cut the deficit but do it fairly, we'll support them. But if they put the economic recovery at risk and cut vital public services, then we will certainly oppose those.
As the pageantry is packed away, MPs file back to the Commons to begin days of debate on the bills and choices to come. Ben Wright, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's get some reaction to the speech now. With me are Chris Huhne, the Energy and Climate Change Secretary, and Yvette Cooper, until a few weeks ago, the Work and Pension Secretary, now the Shadow Work and Pension Secretary. Yvette Cooper, was there much that you disagreed with in that speech?
Well, we obviously have to wait and see the detail, but clearly where there are measures to support the economy or support democracy, then we will work with the government to support those. But I didn't actually see any measures to support the economy or the recovery. And in fact, I think we were quite worried by many of the measures that they announced yesterday, not to Parliament, which was unfortunate, but which involved cutting up to 80,000 youth jobs, for example, at a time when, you know, unemployment is still a serious problem, and cutting major business support as well. So that's a real concern for us, and we'll be watching that very closely.
OK, well, Christian, answer that point about, one, the lack of detail about that, and two, the fact that you announced it in the Treasury, not in Parliament.
Well, you never get an enormous amount of detail in the Queen's speech. By definition, it's a series of headlines, and it's about the government's intentions to bring forward its legislative programme over what's going to be a very long session, 18-month session, so a lot of bills. I think that the overwhelming priority is clearly to make sure that the recovery is continuing and is underway, and that we're tackling the deficit. What's happened in the last few weeks, major crisis in southern Europe with Greece, major worries about whether we could be affected by that if we're not shown to be really tackling the deficit, keeping our own interest rates down and making sure that recovery is underway. And I think a large part of it is actually going to be coming through on the green growth front, on green jobs. And one of the things which is in there is indeed in my own department is this key measure to make sure that we're dealing with energy saving in our housing stock, and that's going to be very employment rich. It's going to be a real opportunity to get green growth and green jobs going in the economy, and that's a transition which we're determined to make. This is going to be the greenest government ever.
Yvette Cooper, I asked you what you disagreed with, and you didn't give me anything that you disagreed with. You said what might not be there, but I'm just wondering whether there's anything in this Queen's speech that you disagree with.
Well, certainly. We disagree with the proposal to rig Parliament, this 55% rule, which I think is unfair. Nobody had that in their election manifesto. Nobody voted for that, and it is really trying to change the rules of Parliament to do a dodgy deal to shore up the Tory Liberal government. I don't think that's fair. On the other hand, we will support measures which are about a sensible right of a recall for MPs where there have been MPs who have, you know, broken serious rules, all those sorts of things, which we think are a sensible thing. So we will look at this seriously, but I do think there is a big gap at the moment between the rhetoric and the reality that this new government is saying it supports democracy and supports recovery. Look at the detail. Actually, they're trying to really skew the democracy and also, I think, hit the recovery with major cuts. I mean, Chris didn't respond to my point about major cuts to business support, major cuts to help for youth unemployment, at a time when really the recovery is still fragile. That's what's at risk here.
Well, everybody knows that we have the largest budget deficit in Europe, the biggest gap between tax and spend in the whole of Europe, including Greece. And this is not something that we can afford to ignore, unlike what happened under the last Labour government, where obviously there was a whole series of
You were
decisions.
making a completely different argument during the election campaign only 3 or 4 weeks ago.
Well, that's not true. We always said very clearly that we need to have a credible deficit reduction programme.
And you said to do it immediately, and you said to do it immediately would be wrong.
Well, two things have happened, if I may say so, since then. First of all, we have a major crisis going on in southern Europe, with the markets beating up Greece in a way that I don't want ever to see happen to a British Chancellor of the Exchequer or a British Governor of the Bank of England. And the second thing is we've had a further fall in sterling, so there's a more stimulus coming through to the manufacturing sector in particular than there was there. So I'm pretty confident that we're going to get that recovery going. We've got to make sure we deal with the deficit, because that's the real threat in terms of interest rates, in terms of the market panic that you could see going on in southern Europe. That's the real threat to our recovery. But just to come back to the point that was made about the constitutional side, it was the Labour government, after all, which introduced a broad measure of support for fixed-term parliaments in Scotland. And in Scotland, the measure actually requires 66%, not 55%, but 66% to trigger a new election. And this was something that the Labour government introduced. So I don't think you can really accuse the coalition government of rigging something. This is a proposal which will obviously be discussed in Parliament.
Okay,
I think it is rigging. The Scottish Parliament is very different, and you know the rules for the Scottish Parliament were set up in a very different way, and with cross-party agreement. You don't have that for this, and I think this would be deeply unfair. And finally, I think, look, we all agree, of course, the deficit's got to be brought down. It's got to be done in a fair way as well, and in a way that supports growth. And the mad thing about the things that your government is doing, that I can't believe actually in your heart of hearts, Chris, you and the Liberal Democrats really support, is to cut support for business and for jobs right now this year. That's what's so mad.
Well, there we must leave it. This debate will continue in the Commons chamber this afternoon. Thank you both very much indeed for being with us. Well, education is a major theme in the Queen's speech. New laws will be brought in allowing more schools